Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast with Dotun and Tim Vickery.
Welcome to the Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast. This is the Thursday edition, of course, where we interview an author about a book that they put out with a football interest. Legendino, as you can see, is suited and booted. It's a good job you are, Tim, because you know all those things you used to say about Sir Alf Ramsey. Well, today the chickens are coming home to roost because we've got Grant Bage with us, who's just written a new biography of Sir Alf. Grant, welcome to the Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honour.
Well, it's our pleasure as well, not least because Alf still dominates the landscapes for football supporters in England, 60 years and counting, to be honest. And you can't get enough. I have got one biography, Sir Alf, by Leo McKinstry, I think it is. I don't know if you read that one during your excursion.
That was the kind of previous biography, 2006, and Leo McKinstry did a fantastic job in so many ways. And I kind of used some of the evidence he discovered because, of course, 20 years ago, there was still a lot of Alf's kind of teammates and colleagues and friends who were still alive. I mean, sadly, that's not so much the case now. So I've interviewed people, but I've also delved into the archives a lot simply because of that kind of time gap, people passing.
Having said that,
this is a subject that's dear to my heart, Alf, because I'm waiting for something that tries to discover the enigma that was Alf Ramsey. I hope you noticed that on the shirt it's a copy of a shirt that Roger Daltrey wore in the video of Substitute, which came out in 1966. So it all fits together. But there's a story, and I hope this doesn't offend people. But there's a story that I came across recently about Ramsey from right at the end when he's at Birmingham City. He's managing Birmingham. He didn't want to do it. He was there in another capacity and he ended up becoming the manager. This is kind of late 70s. And he's a man out of time. Now, he really is. He's from a different age and and the story I come across is a young right back who wasn't getting a game. And the older players put him up to it a little bit, go in and tell the manager that you're not happy. So he did, knocked on Alf's door, and Alf, almost certainly in a three-piece suit, certainly, come in, what can I do for you? And the player, I can't remember his name. He had a career with Blackburn.
Lessons, was that the voice?
Yeah, indeed. We'll get there. He had a career with Blackburn, I think, afterwards. And he said, manager, I'm not happy. I'm not getting in the team. I want to go on the transfer list. And Alf says, well, sit down. Are you really sure? Are you really sure you want to? But who on earth is going to buy you? You're fucking crap. And it's such a, you think, I think there's so much about Ramsey in that little story. So I'm so happy that you've come to the table, Grant, to try.
Constructive feedback was was his speciality. And seriously, I think it was, and that anecdote, which I think in many ways does characterize lots of stuff that we think we know about Alf and also things that we do know. And one of the things we do know is that he was absolutely brutally honest in his feedback to players. But there's lots of other testimonies where players testify to his kindness.
The loyalty that they had to him was, especially the England boys, the loyalty was considering that because he comes across as such an austere, aloof, cold figure, but you get the feeling that with his blokes, that there's other sides to him.
It's really interesting that you talked about his three-piece suits, because of course he was, and it was commented upon in the 50s and the 60s. He was one of the best dressed managers that they'd kind of ever seen, and he had his suits made for him. He was always really well tailored. But in the 50s and 60s, he was a tracksuit manager. Yeah. He was one of the original tracksuit managers. and he always played with the players. And, you know, he often took a right pasting because obviously he was a little bit older than them and a bit slower.
And
But
he wasn't quick even at his heyday, was he?
He was never quick when he was young, let alone
Yeah.
when he was middle-aged. But he loved that contact with the players, and he became a different person kind of in a team, in a squad, and when he was mixing with them. That's, some people say that's the only place he felt at home.
Right. In that, and another thing that I think is really important about him and really, really striking is, and this is part of, I think, of how English football for decades and decades and decades didn't learn the lesson of Ramsey, is that so often you read about accounts of '66 and how it was Alf putting his trust in the age-old virtues of English football. And the reality is, in his own very strange, very pragmatic way, he was an absolute revolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, the Wingless Wonders, which were sort of presented to the world in Madrid in December 1965.
We did a Brazilian Shirt Name podcast dedicated to that very game.
Amazing. I mean, you know, that frosty kind of foggy evening in Madrid, and Peter Lorenzo, it was the I think Daily Mirror journalist at that point, who coined the phrase the Wingless Wonders, and it was absolutely revolutionary. And it looks to me as though Alf had been developing that approach, that formation, playing with it throughout 1965, but kind of wanted to keep it under wraps.
Yeah. Yes.
And
a lot like and Argentina did this when they won in '86. They had the back three.
Yeah.
He didn't unleash it until it was necessary.
Yes. But what's also really interesting, of course, is that Martin Peters and Jeff Hurst were really late introductions to the team. I mean, it was in the previous 12 months before the World Cup was won that those two players kind of won their first caps and were introduced to the squad. Now, they'd been in the under-23s and they'd been around, but the idea that he'd been kind of honing this squad is true year on year on year, but he was still introducing new ideas and new players really pretty late on.
It's the ideas that fascinate me, because one thing that we seem to know about him is that he despised anyone who wasn't English. And if you look at the development of his football and the way that, you know, we all know the story about him turning up at Scotland, you know, and getting a welcome from the Scottish FA.
Well,
Yes.
But did it happen is the question. Go on.
Yeah.
Did he say Did he say them words?
I think he almost certainly did. But the point I'm trying to make
did he mean them xenophobically? I think we need to discuss this. So
okay, we will do in a moment.
Possibly. But he was xenophobic about almost everyone else. But if you look at the development of his ideas, they are so cosmopolitan. I mean, as a player still with Southampton, he tours Brazil. And one of the things, and Ramsey could play. He couldn't run, but he could play. He was a very constructive fullback. My old man raved about him. And he's going to Brazil where they're starting to pioneer with the back four. And he sees, well, you know, you bring the extra centre back, that pushes the fullbacks out wider and the fullbacks can then push forward. And he sees that and he incorporates that later on. And then at Tottenham with Arthur Rowe, he's in a side which I think has been forgotten and shouldn't be. It's a bit, the push and run side of 50-51 has been eclipsed even by Tottenham fans by the double winning side a decade later. But the push and run side is the revolutionary one. And if you read accounts of the push and run side, it's Guardiola. Pass, move, pass, move, pass, move, pass, move. And Rowe, the coach, has worked in Central Europe and he's taken some of the ideas from there and brought them in. And then Ramsey sees what Brazil have done, especially 62, but also 58, when they've developed the back four. So they go 4-2-4 and that leaves so much space. So one of the wingers there, Zagallo, who's later the coach, he funnels back and he has this double role as the left winger, but also making the extra man in midfield. And that's exactly what he does with both Ball and Peters. Yes. So he's incorporating so many cosmopolitan ideas, but because all he says is that he seems to hate anyone who's not English, and especially Latin Americans, which doesn't play very well in Mexico 1970. I think English football misunderstood so much of his open, because what seemed to be a very, very closed-minded person was, in fact, in footballing terms, extremely open-minded. And you can certainly see him, I think, as a point on the road towards the total football of the Dutch. You can clearly see it because, Ball and Peters, they're players of multiple. Ball and Peters could have played in the Holland side, I think, without any problems at all.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I would agree with your kind of footballing analysis about the fact that he's resolutely modern and flexible and pragmatic throughout the 60s. Your assumption that he's xenophobic because he's patriotic, I think, we could be here all night. I mean,
onwards.
What mattered above all else to Alf was football. So if he said, these Brazilians, these Argentinians, these Italians, they're great footballers, that's the ultimate compliment. Now, he also criticised he criticised players and officials of all nationalities. What's your evidence that he was xenophobic towards South Americans, other than the 1966 kind of famous photo, etc., which we'll talk about, I'm sure, because it's, that's. Well, I read that chapter in particular, chapter 12.
Yeah, the game against Argentina. This is fascinating. How in that tour of when they go off to Brazil in '64, he's brilliant, Ramsey, and he clearly sees that Brazil will pose no threat in '66, and he clearly identifies Argentina as the rival. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And Argentina are still reeling from when they come back to the World Cup in '58 and they lose 6-1 to Czechoslovakia, so they go very defensive and very brutal and very counter-attacking. And Ramsey is assimilating this. It's absolutely brilliant the way that he comes to these conclusions. So the game against Argentina is so loaded in '66, and the Animals quote afterwards, but all the way that he approached Mexico '70, but he mistreats Mexican journalists and
does he? I mean, really, the testimony that says he mistreated Mexican journalists is, I think, largely from Brian Glanville. And if you look at some of the things that Brian Glanville, bless him, because I know he's recently, I mean, I was joking with you guys before about being in the presence of footballing gods. I mean, Brian Glanville and Jonathan Wilson, who you interviewed last week. I mean, I listened to that and I just quaked in my boots, because there's like, these guys have been to so many World Cups. I've never been to any World Cups. I'm just a football fan and an historian who's found some interesting things out that I think do help us to understand Alf. But if you look at what Brian Glanville wrote in 1970 about Mexican football, about Mexican footballers, about Mexican society, that's more xenophobic than anything that Alf Ramsey ever wrote or said. Now, I totally understand that the 1966 quarterfinal with Argentina, I totally get how that played in the whole of South America. But that's to do with a lot of other stuff that isn't much to do with Alf, the Malvinas and kind of all racism, imperialism, etc. Yeah. It's very little to do with actually things that he said. And not all Mexican journalists hated Alf. I mean, he got the same sort of mixed reception in the Mexican media as he did in the British media, which was, a few people liked him, and a lot of journalists hated him because he didn't really get on with them.
What fascinates me from the kind of social historian thing is how much he's a creature of his time and how those times are changing. And it's very much my old man's generation. My old man is 4 years younger, and from a similar kind of, because Ramsey's from Dagenham. But Dagenham was rural.
Yeah. He's from Becontree, right. And he's from the edge of Becontree Heath. And he was born in January 1920, and he's literally born, and surrounding him, he's in this little kind of hut, and surrounding him all these fields of kind of broccoli and rhubarb and cabbages, and because Dagenham is a massive area of market gardening to feed London, basically.
Yes.
And he's his ancestors on both sides, you know, his father, his grandfathers were hay and straw dealers. These were very rural people. He's never an East Ender. He's much more of an East Anglian. He comes from South Essex. One side of his family come from Suffolk. They kind of were internal migrants in the 1860s and 70s and moved 50, 60 miles south to find work. These were rural people. And of course, Dagenham was then built over. The Becontree estate was the biggest housing development in Europe between 1920 and 1935. So it's really, that's one of the things that first got me into Alf, was when I was reading about him about 10 years ago, because I did a book for kids on football, the story of football, it's for an education kind of publisher, Classroom Resource. And it kind of said about his rural roots. I thought that's really interesting, because being a kind of Suffolk boy in East Anglia myself, I'm up for anybody who hasn't got mains, water, electricity, kind of drainage, and that was the kind of rural place that he grew up in. I thought this is really interesting, because I'd always assumed, like you, I mean, I watched the 66 World Cup, the 70 World Cup, etc. I'd always assumed that either he was posh, and when I looked into it a bit more, he wasn't posh. Oh, he came from the East End. There's no way. He's absolutely rural. And the reason that he's got that posh accent is just as much to disguise his actual rural kind of dialect, his rural way of speaking. It's nothing really to do with the East End. And Bobby Moore and Jimmy Greaves and others used to rip the mickey out of him for it, because they were proud they could speak with a London accent and it didn't affect their standing. And Jeff Hurst talks about
that social change, that
change.
working class self-confidence which develops through the 60s. But Ramsey predates that. So Ramsey, it seems, he spends his whole life with a phone voice, And because my old man's like this country boy, like that, on the verge, with a country accent, who did a lot of having a phone voice, and we never had a phone. But it's that thing you can't, because you're gonna get the rise taken out of you. If you're living in Woolwich, you're gonna get the rise taken out of you if you speak like a yokel. So the very stilted way he speaks is very much of its time. But is it him putting a barrier up between him and the world?
It's totally. We need to talk about his childhood nickname. We need to talk about the rumors about him, and we need to talk about his kind of social and family background to be able to understand that. Because it wasn't just that, I became a football manager in 1955 at Ipswich, and then I was appointed to England in 62 and started in 63 properly. And it wasn't just, I've got to talk posh now because I'm going to be on the telly and the radio. I mean, it was some of that, but his teammates from the 40s and the 50s talked about him sounding like he came from Norwich, that he had a sort of burr, that he had a country accent. They talked about the fact that his family kept lots of greyhounds. He was never that kind of East Ender. He was surrounded by people who'd moved to Becontree from the East End, but he wasn't of that kind of background himself. So it's quite complex. He is putting up a barrier between himself and the world, and between himself and the media, because we know that the media can be quite voracious of football managers, but it's much more to do with his roots.
I think there's a certain extent, and by the way, good job in terms of your research, but there's a certain extent to which you have got the unenviable task of rewriting the history of Sir Alf, as we can always already hear from some of the things that Tim is saying, which you challenge in your book. Let's start with his ethnicity, because there seems to be a question around that and to what extent that played into the Sir Alf Ramsey that won the World Cup.
Yeah. So he had a nickname that he was lumbered with when he was playing schoolboy football in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And I refer to it in the book. I refer to it here as the D word. It's nowadays, we would say it's a seriously racist term. And Alf Ramsey had that throughout his life. Throughout his life, it's referred to in various kind of settings. So journalists talk about it. Jimmy Greaves testified to it as late as the early 1990s. It's there throughout Alf's life, from his schoolboy days to right after he's finished his football management days. He never used it about himself. And that's a kind of sign that this was not welcome.
Was that simply because of the colour of his hair rather than any facts about his background?
It's also to do with his skin tone, Dotun, and the person who finished up as the mayor of Dagenham and was a councillor throughout the 70s, 80s and 90s also played football and cricket with Alf Ramsey. He was almost exactly the same age. And he testified just at the time that Alf Ramsey died that Alf's nickname was due to his skin tone, not just his hair and his eyes. He did have a dark complexion, but that racially loaded, and I would argue racist nickname, was also because of skin tone, but it wasn't just that. What I think seals for me that he did suffer from snide racism were the persistent rumours that he also came from a gypsy Romany traveller background. Now, Bobby Moore refers to that in 1973, and this is through Leo McKinstry. That's why I say, he did a brilliant job 20 years ago collecting testimony. Bobby Moore referred to that rumour in front of the whole busload of the England football squad and journalists, because they were in Czechoslovakia and they're driving along in the team bus, and it slows down because they have to overtake a convoy of Romany gypsies in carts with horses and carts in those days. And Bobby Moore kind of stands up and says to Alf, "Oh, look, Alf, there's all your relatives over there." And that's astounding. Azim Rafiq suffered the same sort of racist taunts from Gary Ballance. And Azim Rafiq, we know about the Yorkshire, the Yorkshire racism employment case. He won it. I mean, can you just listen to that to sink in, that Bobby Moore did the same sort of, was it a joke, a jibe, a Mickey take in 1973 as happened later. Now, of course, times have changed, and I'm not trying to take that in isolation, but there's lots of evidence that journalists and players were aware of this twin track of Alf's racist nickname and also these rumours that he came from a gypsy Romany traveller background. Now, when I looked into Alf's family background, I can see what I would say are gypsy traveller links on both sides, certainly in terms of kind of ways of making a living, and a little bit, a few of them live in caravans, but they're not what might be termed traditional itinerant Romany gypsies. But those rumours, twin tracks of rumours, are there throughout Alf's life. And I don't think we've ever really looked at them in a way with clear eyes before. And of course, we can do that maybe a bit more in 2025, a few years on from Black Lives Matter, etc.
You see, the title of your book, which I don't think we've mentioned yet, actually, is The Unseen Sir Alf. An unlikely or a different kind of hero?
Different kind of hero, yeah.
Different kind of hero. Now, and we'll come on to the different kind of hero, I'm sure we'll have time for that, but now when you talk about his skin tone, and honestly, I'm not, saying I'm not an expert any more than anybody else, but just before we came on air, I was telling you today is 60 years since I arrived in these shores. And I can tell you in the mid 60s, you got called names left, right and centre, and the very anecdotes that you give about Bobby Moore. Bob Marley on my mind.
Bob Marley and Alf.
Yeah, that would have been a good combination. Bob Marley did like his football, you know that. But the anecdote that you gave about Bobby Moore, I've had that said to me. I've had that said to me when you're going on a school bus and you see, I don't know, whatever it might be, and people say, look, Dotun, look, there's your family out there, but in those days it was kind of like, what could you do about it? Today,
It
you're
was
absolutely right. You can take it to a
anyone
tribunal.
growing up. I grew up 70s. All of that was just seen as absolute fair game. You know, it was just how it
I'm
was.
not sure about that, Tim. I'm not sure if I thought
It
it was
certainly
fair
was.
game.
No.
Yeah,
It's fair,
exactly. But from other
it's
people,
fair game. It's fair game from the point of the view of the person saying it.
sure.
This is the
But
problem with it, you know,
yeah,
because for something to be
but
funny, it's got to be funny for everyone.
exactly. For the recipient, it wasn't funny, but it was kind of like you put up with it, you lived with it. And I could see Sir Alf thinking, well, how am I going to respond? However you respond, you're digging your own hole, aren't you?
Yeah,
Put the wall
because
up.
if you try and argue back, you make more of a thing of it. And so he just shut up. I mean, I think it's really telling that he did never use that nickname about himself. I mean, if you're comfortable with a nickname, you're quite happy for it to be used about you, or you use it about yourself, even if you're just taking the mickey out of yourself a bit.
But then how do we explain how Bobby Moore was still the captain of England and was the first Englishman to lift up the World Cup when Sir Alf could have demoted him, could have replaced him?
Well, that incident is from 1973, and I mean, you know, we're never going to know. I mean, we know that incident happened because Nigel Clark was on. There was a journalist who was on that bus. He was the Mirror journalist. He was close to Alf. He related that to Liam McKinstry when Liam McKinstry was researching his 2006 book. It's reliable evidence. So we know it happened. I wonder if it's 1973. Bobby Moore's at the end of his career, and I wonder if Bobby Moore is feeling vulnerable. There's also, I mean, I love a bit of local history as well as a bit of international and national history. And I looked at the locality where Bobby Moore lived and found some really interesting evidence about Alf's great uncle. And Alf's great uncle, James Ramsey, came down from kind of Suffolk, and he got as far into Essex. All his brothers and sisters, Alf's granddad and stuff, and great aunts, they kind of got further. They got to Becontree. He stopped at Malden, and he got himself a steam threshing machine. And in 1893, he'd been threshing at a farm, and he kind of arranged a burglary. So a couple of other people came along and kind of helped with the burglary, and a copper stopped them, a police sergeant. They cut his throat. They rolled his body into a ditch. The two other members of the gang, brothers, one was hanged and one was sent to prison. They couldn't find enough evidence that James Ramsey, Alf's great uncle, had actually committed the murder, but they banged him up for 14 years for stealing. And the judge said at that, trial for the second trial for stealing, you were definitely there. And even if we can't prove that you took part in the murder, we know you were there and you were part of it. So he's a notorious, it's an enormous case. It's all the national papers. When he comes out of prison after about 12 years, he's in prison on Portland, he moves to Barking, and it's about half a mile from where Bobby Moore's mother grew up. And in the late 1920s, he had a yard where he worked from with a horse and cart. In the late 1920s, several of his children and grandchildren were living in that yard in caravans. And they were living next to a family who you really could say were kind of more typical gypsy travelers. They were horse dealers, they were itinerant, they were hawkers. They had these occupational kind of gypsy traveler jobs. So it's quite possible that Bobby Moore or Bobby Moore's mum and dad kind of said, Alf's got these kind of relatives because they live just round the corner from us. So all these things can really mix together in a rich brew of rumour and supposition and assumption.
They were also always taking the piss out of him one way or another, isn't it? The stories in the back of the team bus. What's it all about, Alfie?
Well, if I had to pick, I mean, that's one of the theme songs I would pick about Alf Ramsey because he's so enigmatic. It's really interesting that you say thank you for saying you were looking forward to the conversation. It's one of the things that kind of drew me into becoming a bit obsessed with Alf Ramsey over the last 6 years. He's taken over my life.
Do you think, is it true, the story when he takes him to Pinewood for the Bond movie? He takes the squad to Pinewood and he says, we're going to meet Sean Connery. And Greaves hits back with, I've shorn everything now. Is that a true story?
Greaves was so quick-witted, and Alf wasn't. And he did say that. And I mean, there are so many aspects of Alf's character that we can look at in a new light. And one of the things I've kind of looked at in chapter 6, and in no way is this a certain claim or a diagnosis. I mean, I've worked in education a lot, so I've come across, I've come across neurodivergence in my kind of professional life. I just looked at some of the traits and behaviors of the NHS defined ones of autism. And I was looking at the evidence from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, from all these sorts of different people, teammates and people he managed. I wonder if Alf did have neurodivergent aspects of neurodivergence that kind of made him feel different, and also that did make him different. And some of them, I think many of them, probably helped him to become the great hero that he is.
Focus.
We're never going to know, but it's a good question.
Yeah. One of the things that fascinates me about, because it's the first game I remember, England game I remember watching, is the 3-1 defeat to Germany in 72.
Yeah.
It's a quarter final of what is now the European Championships. Yeah. We lose 3-1 at Wembley.
Yeah.
A few days later, we go there and just kick the crap out of them and get a 0-0 draw. With no attempt whatsoever to try and get and it looks, the way that history has been told, as they say, all political lives end in failure. Yeah. It many would argue, he should have gone then, and he stayed on too long, and we didn't qualify for 74. I now think that view is probably wrong, because, and I don't think a lot of people have talked about this, but after 72, he then rebuilds a team. And the team that, they were really unlucky against a Poland side that came third in the World Cup and only lost the semi-final against the champions, West Germany, because it was played on a waterlogged pitch. We didn't realise how good Poland were, and we massacred them. And a month before, his newly rebuilt side, which had a lot of ability in it, they beat Austria 7-0 in the warm-up. That was the problem. They left all the goals there against Austria, and they didn't have any left against Poland. But it seems to me that the side that he was building for 74 could have done really well in that tournament. Right. And because of one unlucky night, we didn't get the chance to find out. And then it looks as if it's all downhill from 1970. I'm not sure that's quite true.
I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, the 73 defeat in Poland, I mean, the first goal was a deflection and the second goal was Bobby Moore's fault. And we talked about Bobby Moore earlier. And I do, Moore 72, 73, he's getting caught, isn't he? He's getting caught for speed.
I'm afraid
sometimes.
that the lifestyle catches up with you in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Those hollow legs eventually. Yeah. And I think that England were incredible. I mean, we know that they were incredibly unlucky at Wembley against Poland. And if they'd have qualified even, who knows what might have happened.
Indeed.
The fact that we didn't qualify is, in a way, the kind of Greek tragedy of Alf's career. It's his downfall. But, the margins were so tight. Even if we'd have gone, would he have been sacked? Don't know. If we'd have gone, how well might we have done? As you say, I mean, we were beaten by West Germany, who won the European Championship in 1972. They won the World Cup in 1974. Poland came third in 1974. I mean, it's not like England were losing to kind of inferior teams.
Yeah, Iceland or something.
Iceland.
And he starts the modern world, doesn't it? It's amazing to think that before he takes over in 62, the selection committee picked the team. But with that bloody mindedness, he says, "No, if you appoint me, I'm going to pick the side."
Yeah, and I mean, he made it. It was part of, it was part of his letter of, the offer of a job. He made it a stipulation that he would pick the side, and that actually the manager was in charge, and it was the end of amateurism. And of course, that came back to haunt him because in many ways he was bullied out of his job, not by FA staff, by the way, who he loved most FA staff and they loved him. It wasn't the staff, it was the kind of volunteers at the top who kind of ran the committees. And
there's one moment in Graham Taylor's England reign. There's one moment when I feel sorry for him, when he's in the meeting with these people. You know, what century are these people from? You know, because one of those around the FA saying, this chap Gascoigne, his behaviour, is this the kind of behaviour that we want to encourage? And you're thinking, this is 1993, and these idiots, you know, you imagine what they were like 20 and 30 years earlier when Ramsey was dealing with them. And there's clearly a class dynamic there, isn't there?
Absolutely a class dynamic, but also it's to do with the kind of traditional FA English love of amateurism. So there's a lot of there's a hangover from that. And we have to remember that Alf was probably the world's best ever Sunday footballer. I mean, Sunday football saved Alf's career between 1936 and 1940. He played Sunday football. It was the only football that was open to him because he worked 6 days a week. Well, apart from Thursday afternoons, he worked on Saturdays. So he couldn't play in the kind of what were then the accepted FA leagues. He had to play in illegal Sunday football.
Did he fiddle his age to get a gig with Southampton after the war because of his age? Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't get the gig because he lied about his age, but he did lie about his age. And they all did. I mean, I kind of quote that in the book, a journalist saying it's amazing how footballers, you know, calendars slow down as they approach 30 and then kind of stop completely. They were, you know, they were all at it. And you have to remember that Alf did not play his first properly professional game until he was nearly 27, in the sense that he'd been in the army for 6 years from 40 to 46. He'd been playing Sunday football from 1936 to 1940. He'd been signed as a sort of occasional professional by Southampton in 1944. So he got paid £2 a game. There was no training. He was in the army. He was employed by the army for 6 years. So he played good football with the army, but he was nearly 27. It was kind of August, September 1946, when he was 26 3/4, that he started playing full-time and training full-time as a professional footballer. I mean, that's absolutely amazing. And then 2.5 years, 3 years later, he's playing in England's first ever foray into the World Cup as the right back in the England team.
I think that hurt him very, very much, didn't it? Losing to the States. I think that's a big part of the story, I think. The determination that he has, you know, to put England back.
Losing to the States and getting thrashed by the Hungarians at Wembley. I mean, those are absolutely crucial moments, I think, in his approach to management and his psyche, his determination to win.
It comes across as an uncharacteristic moment when he says a couple of years before, England are going to win the World Cup. Why do you think he said it?
I trace the origins of that, and it was honestly, it's quite difficult. It's quite fiddly historical work because you have to look at the dates of when people said things and when it's reported in the papers. And I think he first said that in September to get the job. So you've got to picture the fact that basically Walter Winterbottom has resigned, and he'd been the first England manager. He'd done it for about 15 years. He'd never got anywhere in the World Cup. Did an amazing job transforming English coaching, but wasn't that great at the management of the national side. So he leaves after a long time. They advertise the job, the FA, and the prime candidates, people like Joe Mercer and Alf Ramsey, don't apply. So the FA look at the applications they've got and they say, oh, blimey, you know, these aren't any good. We can't appoint any of these people. And that leaks out privately. And amazingly, suddenly Joe Mercer and Alf Ramsey are being interviewed by, I think it was the Daily Mail, and they're given 2 in-depth interviews each. And they talk about what they would do if they got the job. And in that interview, Alf says, oh, I think we can win the World Cup. I really do. If we get everything right, you know, we're at home. And he repeats that line all the way through. And various people in various different books kind of say, oh, he first said that in October, or he first said it in January 1963. I think he first said it in September 1962, before he'd even applied, because he never applied for the job. They approached him. So I think that was a way of trying to actually get them to approach him. But it wasn't bravado, because Alf didn't do bravado. He was very calculating. People said he was an amazing gambler on horses and on greyhounds, particularly in the 40s and 50s. And he was the same about football. He just didn't do bluster. And I think that's part of his specific way of looking at the world. He just always spoke about the world as he saw it. And he saw it in a very realistic light. I honestly think he thought all the way through that they could win. And when I talk to Geoff Hurst, he says, just name dropping, I'm chatting to Geoff all the time. I mean, Geoff Hurst, the highlight of my life, to get 40 minutes on the phone with Geoff Hurst. And Geoff Hurst, in conversation with me, as he said elsewhere, said that he didn't really think that put pressure on the players, because these are elite players anyway. There's no added pressure from the manager saying, I think we can win. And actually, it gives people a lot of confidence. And given how terrible England's performances have been in all the previous World Cups, perhaps that was needed.
He obviously benefits from having a World Cup at home. But I wonder if posterity has played him down because of that. And the Russian linesman and or the Georgian linesman, or wherever he was from, because on that side was a very, very good side that were probably better away from home when they had more of the counterattack.
Yeah,
the performances in 70 when they lose. The performances against the Brazil games are an incredible game, and the Germany game, for all but the last 20 minutes, is a massacre. It was a fabulous team that was capable, I think, of winning the World Cup away.
It was. I mean, everybody's said, and I think including Alf, that the 70 squad was stronger than the 66 squad. And, I mean, we could talk endlessly. I mean, was it, Gordon Banks's dodgy tummy the night before? Well, poor Peter Bonetti's, he's to live with that, that first goal that kind of crept underneath his body, and it was an altitude goal because, of course, the ball did behave differently in the kind of the atmospherics. So I think England were incredibly unlucky in 1970, and it was a stronger squad. And yes, of course, we're always going to say, well, England were at home, so they're bound to be favourites. But actually, they only became favourites in the last few months in the betting terms. I mean, loads of journalists in 1964, 65 and fans, and even in 66 were going, we're never going to get anywhere. We're really not very good. And actually, Alf proved them wrong.
I would argue that the national climate change sometime, and like I said, I arrived here in September the 19th, 1965. I would say certainly I was 6 years old then, so we're talking about a landscape that I was unfamiliar with, but I remember very vividly that the entire country was World Cup obsessed, probably from about the beginning of that year, but I remember very intensely from about March or April of 1966, you could not turn anywhere without seeing World Cup Willie. You couldn't have any programs on television without a reference to England are going to win the World Cup or whatever it was. But the whole nation got very feverish. I don't know to what extent that affected the team as such. But what I wanted to say before, when you mentioned the Greek tragedy, and I suppose that's more kind of my specialist subject. So I know Tim's smiling. He thinks I'm going to take it to Shakespeare, but I'm not on this occasion. I would say it was a Beckettian tragedy. Samuel Beckett being the person who perhaps best in a modern way gets to the core of Greek tragedies in his own work, because the whole of, whatever we say about Sir Alf Ramsey's background or what happened subsequently. Look, the whole of his life and career has now been crystallized into 1 year, which is 1966. That's the defining year, as it were. That's the peak of interest for everybody. It's almost kind of like, well, what happened next wasn't really up to what happened in 1966. So how did he handle that, for example, and how did 1966 winning that World Cup affect him, his thinking on football, and well, how he was, I imagine, trying to replicate that by retaining the World Cup, an unimaginable feat for any country in any case. But that's what he tried to do in 1970, wasn't it? We still believed in 1970 that we had the best team in the world by a long shot.
And I think it's a really good question to ask. Do you know, when I because I've looked at Alf in a lot of detail, I can honestly say that I don't think it affected him that we were the winners in the sense of changing in any way his approach. It made him even more determined to try and win the European Championship in 1968 and to defend the World Cup in 1970. And it just heightened his meticulous professionalism. And the preparations, I mean, both in, for sort of food, diet, medicine, health, for 1970 in particular in Mexico were stunning. And people talk about the fact it was a PR disaster. We started with that, Tim. You were alluding to some of the PR disasters. I think they've been drastically exaggerated for domestic reasons as much as perhaps for international relations reasons, because there were great long gaps in the tournament where nothing much was happening and the press needed to find stories. And Alf kind of supposedly being rather, biased against Mexican kind of culture or newspapers helped to fill that gap. So the famous, England imported their own food. So so did West Germany. I mean, it's just like it wasn't a big deal. That's what they.
So did Brazil.
So did Brazil, just exactly. And so, some of the at the level of public relations, some of those what's seen as gaffes were really quite normal. Alf concentrated only on what was in front of him, and I argue that that's a very useful type of patriotism. He was intensely patriotic about being English. I don't think he was xenophobic. I think he was internationalist in terms of football because he loved learning from anyone who could play football and love football. There's the rivalry with Scotland, that is really intense. I mean, have you ever? I mean, my dad was half Scottish. Have you ever talked to any Scots people about about how they feel about it? I mean, it's just mutually. It's the local national derby. I mean, of course, it's always going to be intense. Alf didn't hate Scots people. He loved them. He had Scots players both as teammates and as a manager when he was at Ipswich. It's just ridiculous to say he was xenophobic. He just wanted to beat Scotland because they were our nearest and dearest, and they loved beating us. And he carried that professionalism. His patriotism was expressed by doing what was in front of him really well, like a teacher, like a nurse, like a builder, like someone who drives a lorry. He wanted to do what he did well. And I don't think being champions in 1966 made him big-headed or kind of made him alter his approach. He just wanted to be professional about winning football games. In
a way, and winning the league with Ipswich Town is an even bigger achievement, isn't it? Because no one saw that coming.
Yeah, I got great. I've got another chance to drop into Geoff Hurst. Yeah, because Geoff Hurst said that exactly, and it's true. I mean, just get this right. He goes to Ipswich in 1955. They're in the 3rd Division South. Within 8 years, he's taken them to win that league, the 2nd Division, the equivalent of the Championship, and the equivalent of the Premiership in 8 years. And that's with a club that, didn't have any internationals. I mean, absolutely stunning. And it's an even bigger achievement than the England achievement in many ways, because with England, he was working with 80 to 100 kind of elite players. He could pick from that sort of number. With Ipswich, well, you know, I'm a lifelong Ipswich fan, but yeah, we were not a footballing superpower in 1955.
No, it was a tactical triumph, wasn't it? It was that was tactics. That was being well ahead of the game. One thing that he didn't do very well was TV pundit. They tried to get him in. I remember him doing this in the mid-70s, and he was absolutely rubbish. He was just awful. He had no idea whatsoever of how to communicate in.
To be fair, though, from what we've said, that was a Richard Nixon's versus JFK moment in the 1960 presidential election. One person knew what the medium of TV was all about and went and got a suntan. The other person, his eyes just looked shifty throughout, and he was, you know, he did only narrowly lose.
He was doing he did a little bit of punditry, but a bit of like co-commentary, you know, with Brian Moore or something.
He did,
and he was hopeless, absolutely hopeless. Do you think this is part of him being on the spectrum?
Yes, potentially. I mean, I think it's just as much to do with self-confidence about expressing himself. I mean, somebody who can mispronounce Sean as seen, I mean, he's always going to be stumbling over his words. He was self-conscious about his speaking accent. I mean, people have been taking the mickey out of him in public about it, as well as in private on the team buses, you know. So in a way, it was a totally alien environment to him. And I know that he was socially very clumsy. I don't know if the hesitance about media presentations was to do with the kind of his psychology, but I'm certain it was very much to do with his lack of confidence and speaking style, etc. But there's no evidence, by the way, historical evidence yet, that he ever took elocution lessons. His voice changed, certainly. So did millions of people. My dad's voice changed. Mrs. Thatcher's voice changed.
Yeah,
like you were talking about your dad having a telephone voice. That's what people did in the 50s and 60s and 40s and 50s and 60s, because it was a way of enhancing your own social mobility. People forget how hierarchical and snobbish English society was.
I think that was just as potent as the three-piece suits that you mentioned for working class people, because I've said this, I think, on this podcast before. You want to hear the Cray brothers speak, you know, the Cray twins speak. They do not speak like the most vicious villains in the East. Actually, they speak quite like that. We are just respectable businessmen. And
they got very nice cufflinks, lovely suits.
I remember that.
You dress to impress. What he was good at, he used to do stuff for the Daily Mirror.
He did. He loved the Daily Mirror.
And it was brilliant. I mean, I know it was brilliant because one of my mates would say, you know, read a daily, and he used to do Tottenham games a lot because that was his club, I think, really, more than anything else. And my mate would say, you know, this Alf Ramsey column, it's exactly what you said about the game on, you know, after you read the game on Saturday. I'm just reading the same thing. So he was obviously brilliant. And the bigger point here is that experience and that insight that shouldn't have been lost to the England national team. Really, it shouldn't, should it? And surely that is a historic crime, and that explains some of the, you know, I mean, when Bobby Moore was mistreated, part of that is personality thing. And Ron Greenwood didn't get on with him, did he? And when Ron Greenwood gets the England job, you don't want to know about Moore. He brings in your great mate Jeff Hurst as his assistant. But just that. They seem to have their knives out for Ramsey, and so all of that knowledge and that insight that all got lost, didn't it?
I mean, that really is tragic. And of course, they went to Don Revie. I mean, Joe Mercer did 7 games after Ramsey was sacked, and then Don Revie came in, and you know, it's an absolute disaster.
It is
in every possible way. I mean, you couldn't really imagine a more disastrous, and I mean it's so
and that game, the big one that he loses 2-0 away to Italy, it's one of the worst performances ever by an England team, and the whole thing makes no sense whatsoever. And you think that this fella who was so good, but obviously in an England thing, you know, he hasn't got the players week after week. He just utterly lost. And Ramsey surely should have been involved somehow.
I totally agree. And one of the things that I've tried to do throughout through the book is a way to reconcile English views of Alf Ramsey, to try and help us to see him for how he was and why he was like that, and to make him, if you like, the true national hero that he should have been. And if the FA in the mid 1970s had different amateur leadership, I think they might have done that. But he was bullied by an Oxford professor who became the chairperson of the FA and was the vice chair throughout Alf Ramsey's kind of time, latter years. And he really effectively wanted to push Alf Ramsey out of the job. And that poisoned the atmosphere totally. And I think it poisoned the atmosphere helped poison the atmosphere between England players, as well as between Alf Ramsey and the FA in the 1970s. And I think that there's a hangover of that, which is, I don't think we've ever really celebrated Alf in the way that we should as a national hero. And what the book is saying is that actually he's a very modern hero. He's not that kind of strange, odd, sort of synthetic kind of false person that he appeared, particularly in 1970s telly, which is probably where our first impressions of him were kind of gained from. He wasn't really that person at all. He was a wonderful guy.
Different kind of hero is how you describe him in the subtitle of the book. We're coming to the end of this conversation, but just one thing from me, and you kind of summed it up there, which is kind of, this is history, isn't it? It's easy to say, look, this is a biography of England's most successful ever coach, manager, as he was in those days, wearing an Admiral tracksuit. But it's also history. Sometimes football is more than just the football. It landscapes who we were. The memories that we share are related to, for example, England winning the World Cup or not winning the World Cup or whatever it might be. And it strikes me that even when you were saying the thing about England importing their own food, look, how I hear it, how I see that, how I come to terms with it is different from the way that you perhaps do as an academic, going through the vast archives of letters and communications. And, like I say, you've done a really good job of that. But how I see it, what resonates for me as a reader is that that's the way we were in those days. We didn't eat anything foreign. We didn't eat anything we couldn't pronounce, let alone spell. We didn't. No, we didn't. We went over.
I remember going to college in 84 and coming up against chili con carne. What's all that about?
Exactly.
The first time I ate a black olive, I was 21. It was like, I didn't know what it was.
The first time I ate spaghetti, they used to have them in these really long, they were like about 1 meter long wrappers, and I just couldn't get my head around it. So I bought one, probably with my pocket money, and I just put it in hot water, and I thought, this tastes all rubbery. What are people on about? It took me years to realize how to cook spaghetti, let alone spell it. No, we did. But I'm saying this is history, because everything you've said and we've discussed and you've written in the book is about the way people spoke in those days, the way working class people were regarded, the way, people of an ethnicity, for goodness sake, people would be sitting at home laughing their heads off that somebody who had a little bit of a suntan was regarded in sort of like racist terms. But my neighbour, right across the road from where I'm speaking to you now, and he's a white guy, he's got grey hair now, and he's maybe in his late 60s, whatever.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, nothing wrong with that at all. I'm happy for that. But the late 60s bit, not the grey hair bit. But anyway, he said to me once, "Oh, I've been racially abused." And I thought, oh no, not another one of these people who think they share my burden. But no, he said to me, look, when I was younger, I had black hair, really black hair, and I grew up in Swindon or somewhere out in the sticks. And once I was working in an abattoir, and they weren't sort of abusing him in a sort of pejorative. They weren't abusing him to put him down, but somebody was describing him, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, you know Jeff, he's the," and they use the P word. You see what I mean? In those days, people did that, but today you'd be like, "Hang on, he's probably 100 generations. He's like the Queen. Look at the royal family."
This will amaze you, but I had that in like long hot summer, like '76, because I tanned quite easily, and I was out all the time playing football and cricket, and I had the P word in 1976.
You may have spotted that at the end of chapter 2, I cite a podcast in which Gary Lineker briefly discussed the fact that when he was a youth, because he's got a slightly darker skin tone, and he discussed the fact that he received some racist abuse, and it was just, I mean, what sort of society were we? It's like
we were the society that won the World Cup, for better or worse. Listen, we've got to wrap it up, mate. We've been talking for over an hour here, which is great and wonderful. Don't get me wrong. Sir Alf Ramsey, do you think, on this one final note, do you think you have done enough with your book to rewrite the history of Alf Ramsey? Listeners who were listening to this from the very beginning will know that you and Tim had, some slight disagreement each time Tim posed
he's putting me right. It's not a disagreement.
Sure. That's the way I look
correction.
at it.
It's correction.
Correction. Okay. Have you done enough to correct the misapprehensions about Sir Alf Ramsey that are still out there? Have you done enough with this book or not?
Well, we'll be able to tell that when he appears on a banknote, or when there's a statue outside Wembley, or when there's some blue plaques up in Dagenham, when there's a decent statue in Becontree, when actually he's become accepted as a national hero for the 2020s as he was in the 1960s. That's the only reason I did 6 years of research and have written the book, because I think he really is potentially a hero for the modern age.
Well, thank you very much. And it's been an absolute pleasure. The book's called The Unseen Sir Alf, a different kind of hero, by our guest, Grant Bage. Thanks, Grant.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, Tim, you're in your element now. You've got that off your chest now, yeah? You've got that.
That's great.
Off your chest,
if I could spend my whole life researching and talking about this and Alf and the mid-60s and all those changes, that's where I want to plant my flag. But reality keeps moving us on, to this horrible cashless society and apps and all the rest of it. I'm happier back talking about the 60s and Alf and the Who and Substitute.
Well, come on, we'll find a hill and we can plant our flags together. Come on, we can stick there. Yeah, we can die in this ditch. I'd
advise you to tell Tim how much of a financial burden it is to spend 6 years researching some bloke for a book. But hey, he won't be seen in those Roger Daltrey shirts for much longer. Let's put it that way.
Get in touch with the Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast on Twitter @BrazilShirtPod, or you can email us brazilianshirtnamepod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and tell a friend. The Brazilian Shirt Name Podcast is an 1129 production.